I'm going to show you how to whip together some quick biscuits. So the ingredients I'm going to be using are 6 tablespoons of cold butter. It's very important this is cold. So you want to actually throw it in the freezer 20, 30 minutes before you start using it. So I threw mine in the freezer right before we started recording here. 2 cups all-purpose flour. If you're using weight, which I recommend, that would be about 250 grams. You've got 1 tablespoon of baking powder, not soda, powder. 1 tablespoon of sugar, a teaspoon of salt, and then 3/4 cup buttermilk. If you don't have milk, full fat milk or heavy cream will also work. That's all the ingredients. That's it. So it's pretty easy. I'm going to start pulling these things out. The first thing we're going to do is actually grate the butter. So if you've got a box grater, you can use that. I'm going to cheat, and I'm going to just use my food processor with its cutting disc attachment because that makes life a lot easier. And the reason it's important that our butter is cold for this is because when the butter's cold, it doesn't melt out of the dough when it's baking. It ends up steaming and creating rise in these beautiful little pockets in your dough. 6 tablespoons. Boom, done. And you'll probably have like a little pad left that didn't quite break up. That's totally fine. We'll just break that up by hand. So I'm just getting this out here. And then what I'm going to do while I measure out the dry ingredients is I'm going to throw this back in the freezer again for a couple of minutes so that it just stays really nice and cold. I like to lay out my ingredients because it gives us significantly more precision. So we need 250 grams of flour, and then I'm going to keep this out because we're going to want a little bit more to put onto the surface when we're rolling out the dough. There we go, 251, close enough. 1 tablespoon of this, which is about 15 milliliters. Right, tablespoon? Yep, tablespoon baking powder, not baking soda. Baking powder is baking soda plus some extra chemical leaveners, which give it a second rise. Next up, I need some sugar, so we're going to do 1 tablespoon sugar and 1 teaspoon of salt. That's 3/4 cup buttermilk. Okay, so I'm going to set the buttermilk in the back. Just going to be set to the side. I'm going to got a little whisk here. You can just use a fork or you can use your fingers. I'm just making sure that all the dry ingredients are fairly homogeneously mixed. I'm going to throw our beautifully shredded butter in with all the dry ingredients here. So mix it lightly by hand. We're just aiming for this to look a little crumbly. We don't need it to be perfectly smooth. If it's perfectly smooth, you've probably overmixed it. Feel free to break apart any larger chunks that you're running into. After that's mixed up and nice and crumbly, then we pour in our buttermilk, barely mixing this. We don't want it to actually be a smooth mixture. We want it to be kind of crumbly and shaggy looking, is how this is often described. Yeah, it's still a little wet, and that's totally fine. We need to flour our surface now, so we've got somewhere to work. So I'm just kind of working this together a little bit. And then what I'm doing here is I just kind of work this together a little bit, the biscuit dough here. And I didn't want to overwork it. If we overwork it, we heat up the butter too much with our hands, number 1. Number 2, we create too much gluten development. And instead of having these light, fluffy, buttery biscuits, we have these really tough biscuits. So what we're doing is I'm using my fingertips here because your fingertips hold less heat than the palms. And I'm flattening out the dough a little bit. And then what I'm doing is I'm going to fold it 5 to 6 times. There's a little bit of stuff sticking to the counter, and that's totally fine. It just means I need to butter the counter a little bit more. Not butter, flour. I got butter on the mind. Flatten out a little bit more. So you fold over towards you and then turn it 90 degrees. Flatten it out with your fingertips. Do it again. So this is number 2, 3. And if while you're doing this, it feels like your butter's getting warm, if your fingers are starting to get greasy because the butter's melting on them, wrap it in some saran wrap. Just throw it back in the fridge for about 15 minutes so that butter foams up again. And that's going to help keep everything work a little bit better for you. So that's number 4. I'll probably just go for 5 folds here. So that's 5. That's plenty. So I'm going to flatten this out with my fingers one more time. I'm going to use a biscuit cutter. If you don't have a biscuit cutter, you can just cut the shapes. I'm aiming for 5 to 6 biscuits out of this. And I'm trying to just flatten this until it's about an inch tall before I cut my biscuits, so they're all about the same size. So this is a 2 2/3 inch biscuit cutter. The size doesn't actually matter all that much as long as you just use the same size for all of your biscuits. Here's your pan, parchment paper on top, pan. Nothing too crazy there. Extra little pro tip here. If you want, and I'm somewhat experimenting with this because I made these last night and I wasn't super thrilled with how dark the tops came out. They were fine. They tasted great. I just wanted more darkness going on, more coloration. It's usually a sign of more flavor. So what I'm going to do is I'm melting a little bit of butter in the microwave over here, probably about a tablespoon. Just everything for about 30 seconds. And then I'm going to brush that on top of these before they go in the oven. And by doing that, that should promote more browning on top of the biscuits so that they come out really beautiful golden brown. And so when you're using your biscuit cutter, you want to push straight down. A lot of people push and twist. You want to avoid the twist because the twist seals up the edges and keeps those beautiful layers from showing up. So you can probably see a little bit the layering, if that'll focus. What's going on there? That's what we want. Then when you set those on your pan, you want them to be pretty close to each other, actually, about maybe half an inch apart. So this is what the biscuits look like on the pan. Get my butter out. Just brush the tops. And so normally these would bake at 425 for about 12 minutes, just to promote some browning on the tops of these. If you don't want it to be really brown on top, you can add the butter afterwards or not add it at all, but adding the butter will definitely add some really nice flavor. So our oven's set to 450 Fahrenheit, which is 230 Celsius. And these biscuits typically bake at 425. And so this is actually a really great example of how often when you bake things, you can be pretty flexible with your temperatures a little bit. We got a little bit of browning on top. These are in for about 12 minutes still at 450. So that extra 25 degrees didn't screw anything up per se. So what's great is they tipped over so we can see the layers a lot better. But you can see how flaky these layers are and how they just fall right off. And how there's a little bit of browning on top. And then the bottom, we have a good amount of browning because of contact with the metal of the pan. So these don't look the greatest, not the greatest example of biscuits I've ever done. Probably what happened is when I was pushing the cutter down, it angled to one side more than the other or something, and it made them all angle funny. Or I folded it weird, or there's a million things that could happen. I'll keep practicing this so that when I really teach it to you, I'll show you how to avoid that. But in the meantime, these biscuits are still going to taste phenomenal.